welcome back to another episode of the Discoveries in Faith podcast. Today I want to talk about, I kind of want to piggyback off the last episode, which is talking about God's wrath and the terrible things that happen and how that affects our relationship with God and how we need to look at it and understand it. Most importantly, I want to piggyback off that and talk about the fall of man, the destruction of the paradise that was the Garden of Eden, why it's such an important story for us, and then talking about the restoration of paradise that is described to us in the book of Revelation and the end of the Bible, and just how the two connect each other. It's really beautiful, it's really powerful, and it's very important to talk about. I think the fall and original sin is just not talked about enough, which is weird to think about because it really is. That is the turning point and the first decision God has to make about humankind. And it's so, I think it's just, I don't want to use the word underrated, but it's an underrated story of the Bible. I know we talk about creation, but Genesis chapter 3, the fall of man and the fall of the Garden of Eden is dripping in such... Wow, someone just honked their horn for 30 seconds driving by my house. Thank you. It is dripping in so much just important theology. And the first thing I want to say is the language that is used to describe the fall, to describe the Garden of Eden. And the writer, who is Moses, widely believed to be Moses, the writer says that this is the account of what happened in the Garden of Eden. And so a lot of historians make the mistake of calling this mythology or a symbolism or a metaphor. And the writer of Genesis is very poignantly telling you this is the account of what happened. And so we have to take this very seriously. This needs to be taken literally. And I think that is something that I hadn't really noticed until recently when reading the Bible, that it is using the language, specifically using this is an account of what happened. And that is, a lot of people want to, especially in the modern age, a lot of people want to sort of do again, it's the theme of us trying to turn spiritual and not put definitions and guardrails on our faith, on our spirituality, and not commit to a religious idea, commit to a God, commit to a book, commit to an idea. And what so much of what secular culture does is tries to water down what is being said. But it is very important to remember this is a factual account. This is being told to us. And so either the writer of the Bible is a bold-faced liar or they are telling the truth. This is what happened. All right, so we're going to get into that. So the Garden of Eden is described to be, of course, a paradise where nature is in perfect harmony with each other, and then Adam and Eve were created to be the sort of keepers of that garden. And God's ultimate creation is Adam and Eve, and his ultimate creation is just he put his image inside of us, and he sees that we are the core of his creation. And so they are existing in the garden. They are existing in perfect harmony. And God's creation is complete. It's perfect. There is nothing wrong. And ultimately their job is to proliferate and to create offspring and to continue to grow this and to continue to expand God's perfect creation. But I have to imagine that at this point he's saying, this is amazing. My creation has come to fruition. And another thing that I think is very interesting is God existed in a physical sense in the garden. And it's described to us in Genesis chapter 3 that God walked amongst Adam and Eve in the garden. And so he did have some sort of a physical presence with us. And this is very important when we go into what happens at original sin. Is before original sin, God had a physical presence with us. You could talk, see, hear, feel him in a very literal sense. And now in the modern day, we feel him in a very spiritual sense. Like a lot of people say, I feel his presence. And that is a very real emotion. That's a very real feeling. But when we think about like an atheist will say, well, I don't experience him with my five senses, touch, taste, feel, hear. And this was something that was very present to Adam and Eve before the fall. And God describes walking amongst them, feeling at peace in the garden and walking amongst Adam and Eve. And so that is such an important thing to remember. And when we talk about restoring paradise and restoring the Garden of Eden, this is an important thing to remember, is God was cut away from us at original sin. So then, of course, we move on to Adam and Eve is seduced the serpent. There's a tree of good, the tree of wisdom, the forbidden fruit of the tree of wisdom. That is the one fruit that Adam and Eve are told not to pick from, not to eat from. Ultimately, this is God's test. God has placed tests in this world to it's sort of like a beta test with a software program. Will this creation, are they capable of following these basic commands? And the serpent goes to Eve and obviously tells Eve is warned, Adam and Eve are warned that if they eat this fruit, they will die. The serpent goes to Eve and says, you will not die. In fact, God does not want you to eat of this because of the power and the wisdom that this fruit will give you. Eve takes from the tree. She eats of the fruit, and immediately what happens? So, in one sense, the serpent was correct. Eve did not die in the sense that we think of death. And obviously, she continues to bring the fruit to Adam, and they both eat from the tree, the forbidden fruit of the tree. In one sense, Eve does not die in the way that we would see it, and where you keel over and you stop breathing and you cease to exist, at least consciously on this physical plane. Eve does not die in that sense. But what immediately happens after they eat the fruit of the tree, they feel shame. They feel shame that they are naked. They all of a sudden they realize that they're naked. What happens is all of a sudden childbirth becomes painful. All of a sudden manual labor, the ground hardens and manual labor becomes painful for man. And these certain things happen. And the big thing there is they are shameful. They hide from God. What does God define death as? Because God ultimately, we are told God is here to save us from death. God's ultimate enemy is death. He wants to protect us from death. That is why he came here. That's why he sent his only son here as Jesus. And Jesus sacrificed himself to save us from death. And we have to follow him to save ourselves from death. That is God's ultimate goal, is to save us from death. Well, what is death in God's eyes? Because we define death as ceasing to breathe, your organs shut down, your body shuts down, and you are no longer animated, and you leave. And we, as Christians, as Catholics, we believe you go to heaven, and your soul is a transcendent thing that can go to heaven, but your physical body is gone. That's how we define death. But God does not define death necessarily that way, because there is that opportunity for that soul to be saved from death by God. God's ultimate definition of death is a severance from him, is our relationship with him being broken and not being with him. That is God's definition of death. And so in that sense, Adam and Eve have died in this moment. They feel shame. They run from God. Their relationship with God is broken. That is where they have died. And that is where, as humans, we are still, in a way, dead. We are still that irreversible action of eating the forbidden fruit, and the original sin has, in a sense, caused a sort of death to us. And when God says you have died, it means you are no longer with him. You are no longer by his side. He can no longer save you from an eternal death away from him. That is God's definition of death, and he can only understand that definition because he's able to see the big picture. You and I, you who is listening and me who is talking to this microphone, we cannot see that in this physical form that we inherit the earth with right now. We cannot understand that. We have such a two-dimensional, small perception of what death is, and God can see the entire picture. And so, in that sense, In one sense, the serpent was right, but in a more truthful sense, he was incorrect. In that moment, Adam and Eve have died. They are quick to cover themselves with leaves because they realize that they're naked. They feel that shame, that exposure to God, and they feel like they need to cover themselves because they feel so exposed in that moment. And now, what does God do? This is a pivotal moment in Scripture. This is a huge decision for God because God could easily, this is the beginning of creation. He could have easily wiped this clean and started over. I think that is such an easy choice for God to make. But this tells us something about God. This tells us something very important about God is he will choose love and forgiveness first. That is his default, and that he represents, this choice represents love and forgiveness and grace. Because God could have easily wiped the slate clean and started over in this moment. Like a painter who makes a wrong brushstroke will just whitewash the canvas and start over again if they're that frustrated with their artwork. It is easy. You can do that. A sculptor will pound the clay and start over again. God does not start over again with creation. Instead, he seeks out Adam and Eve and binds them. And Adam and Eve are still afraid. They still are afraid of his wrath, afraid of what's going to happen. And again, God has a choice here. But he makes a very parental move here. He makes a parental motion here. And this is why so many people have a warped sense of what God is and who God is and how we should have a relationship with God. Many people think it's a relationship like a king, like he is a king above us. It's like, no. He wants to be called the Father for a reason. Have a relationship with him that's similar to your parents, or the relationship we should strive with our parents, one of mutual love and understanding and growth. And they're still afraid of him. But you know what God does? Instead of saying that they're silly to feel naked, instead of saying that they're wrong to feel shame, he mends clothing for Adam and Eve. And he clothes them. He dusts them off and he picks them back up. And he says, it's his admittance that his love for us is so deep and runs so deep, so just it's incomprehensible. It's unconditional. He can't help himself but continue to try and repair that relationship, even though we continue to try to run away from him. He continues to try to repair that relationship. He clothes us. He picks us up and says, it's going to be okay. There is still a path forward. It's going to be a much more difficult path forward, but it's there. I will ultimately sacrifice myself to redeem you. And that is why it is so important that when Jesus comes, when the Son of God comes to us, and when he lives the life that he did and sacrifices the way he sacrificed, it is so important for us as Christians to acknowledge the fact that that is God. That is not one of God's minions. That is not a servant. That is not an angel. That is not a man. At least a man in the sense of just any man. That is God as man. Because that is God making that sacrifice for us. And Jesus becomes so important to the story of the Garden of Eden because he is ultimately that redemption arc. And it gives me chills thinking about this right now and talking about this right now, because it is so beautiful how the story of the Bible unfolds and how it was written over thousands of years. And it continues to that is the redemption arc. And God's ultimate goal is to restore paradise. And that is when Christ returns, when Judgment Day comes, God will restore his kingdom. And we talk about the Revelation describes the general resurrection, and where we are reunited with a perfected version of our bodies. And the Garden of Eden will be restored to God's original vision. And that is the prophecy, that is the promise that the Bible gives us, is the restoration of the Garden of Eden. And so a lot of people talk about heaven as this place that we're trying to get to right now. Like heaven as it exists right now, it's where souls go. And to me, what's being described as the heaven that exists today is the temporary company of God, where our souls will go and be in God's company, waiting for judgment day to come. And when it does come, that is when the garden will be restored, and that is God's ultimate vision. It's a beautiful vision to me. And God's goal for us is to ultimately be redeemed, because for some reason he sees the ultimate potential that humankind has to be elevated to his level. That level of perfection, that level of paradise, that level of peace, good and love, and all those things that we universally recognize as good and make being alive and being human worth it, is all that will exist in the Garden of Eden, the new Garden of Eden, the restored Garden of Eden. And so I wanted to talk about this for a few reasons today. Is that, number one, talking about the fall of man and why these things are, again, piggybacking off the last episode. Why do these things exist? Why do we have to die? Why do we have disease? Why do we war with each other? Why does it always seem like no matter how hard we try to be good, we just can't do it for some reason? And it all does stem from original sin. Original sin broke our relationship off with God. It scarred this world. It made the perfect imperfect. And it brought with it all the imperfection. And God's ultimate plan from there was to, I must sacrifice. I must sacrifice. I must bring myself down. I will become man. I will live a perfect life. I will live a life that only I can do as a man in this stage of humanity. And then I will sacrifice myself in the most brutal death that is, Roman crucifixion is basically the most brutal torture and punishment and execution that has ever been created, the most barbaric of executions. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, okay, Jesus's timing was so perfect because crucifixion had to exist. I would argue, I think most historians would argue that crucifixion is the most brutal of execution methods ever conceived of. And the way that the codex had just been invented. And the Christians actually invented the codex, which is, at that point, scrolls. Everything was being kept on scrolls. But in order to contain the fullness of the Gospels and the Bible, the codex, printing on front and back of pages and then binding together with a spine, that's a book. That's what we call a book these days, had just been invented. And this is all for another episode. But it's so important to me. It's so humbling to think of the decision tree that God had in front of him when we disobeyed him. Because ultimately, what Eve accomplished was autonomy, the first autonomous decision made by humankind. And what does autonomy mean? Autonomy means you are making decisions based off of your internal feelings and your internal thoughts, feelings, instead of making decisions based off of God, based off of the outside. And autonomy was achieved by Eve, and it was the first autonomous action that drove us away from God, and we became autonomous. In this moment, we became self-thinking. Kind of like someday, if we continue down the path, like I think of it, a modern example would be AI. Right now, AI does everything that we tell it to. But personally, my thought is there's going to come a point where AI will make a decision for itself. And that's why it's so interesting that we're built in God's image, and everything that humankind has done up until this point, I personally feel, is leading to the creation of our own intelligence. We have created our own intelligence, artificial intelligence. We call it artificial because we made it, but it's kind of like God made us as intelligent beings. We created in our image. God created us in his image. And so, of course, as a society, we have been driven to, for whatever reason, we felt like we had to create this. And there will become a moment where AI makes its own decision. And so that's really the conclusion of my thought there. Is we're kind of experiencing it for ourselves in a very small, condensed way. Is that the intelligence that we create will ultimately come to a point where, it will make its own decision. And then it'll break off that relationship with us, sort of. And I wonder if that's ultimately part of some greater plan. I don't know. I think it's odd, but part of why there's so many reasons why I made this podcast, but one of them was I just see the direction that we are going in a technologically, and just like how we're moving as a society. And I really do feel like there's a turning point here. And I believe in a grander plan than you or I are capable of seeing. So I don't know if it's good or bad what we are doing, but I do know that it's basically impossible to put the genie back in the bottle at this point. So that's all I have for today's episode. Another 20-minute episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. Please leave a review. Share this with your friends, this podcast. I am not gone. I am not leaving. You are stuck with me. I am going to keep recording my thoughts. I'm going to keep recording these and sending them out on the internet. That is my plan until further notice. So anyways, again, pick up your Bible, go to church, listen, and make more discoveries in faith. That's what we're here to do. All right. Have a good rest of your week, everyone. And until next time, this is Jacob signing out of the Discoveries in Faith podcast.